Hello, and thank you for joining us today to discuss a legal view on open source license compliance from 2021. I'm Marty Melican. I'm the Associate General Counsel and Vice President here at Revenera. I'd like to introduce now my guest for today. His name is Leon Schwartz. Leon is a principal at GTC Law Group, which is unique in that they have an entire group dedicated to open source compliance and due diligence. It's not just some lawyers that dabble in open source from time to time. This is a dedicated group focused on this issue and this issue alone. Like most lawyers and paralegals in the group, Leon's a former software developer himself. He spent almost a decade designing and writing software for companies of various sizes. He now spends his time advising clients on the benefits and risks of open source software, conducting diligence, both internal and as part of various transactions, and setting up practical real-world policies and processes around open source software and compliance. And as an in-house lawyer myself, Leon is one of the experts that I rely on to make sure that Revenera is using open source in a responsible and accurate and legal manner. So thank you, Leon, for your time today. I really appreciate and enjoy our discussions.
My pleasure.
Perfect. So before we get started, sorry about that. There's our slides and our names and our pictures for everybody. Before we get started, let me briefly run through our agenda for today. We're going to talk about the impact of open source license compliance changes in 2021. We're going to talk about an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which I assume most of the people have heard a little bit about. We're going to dive into that a bit and then talk about what that means for in-house counsel in particular. We're going to talk about some GPL enforcement actions that have taken place over the past year, as well as some emergency technology and open source issues that come with that emerging technology. And then we'll talk about watch areas for 2022, right? What should we be on the lookout for as part of our plans for making sure that we maintain our open source compliance programs in 2022? And then we'll end at the end with a review of open source related risk. Most of the folks on this call probably know most of that, but it's always good, I think, to touch back in, particularly with an expert like Leon, on what are the generic risks that are associated with open source, and how do we make sure that we are able to get the benefits out of open source while mitigating the risks of using the open source. So real quick, 2021, a year in review. So Leon, this is, the kind of thing that I, as an in-house generalist, I'm aware of this. I know about it. I know it's out there. I know I have to be concerned about it. But, quite frankly, as someone who doesn't sell directly to the government all that frequently, it does make me feel a little bit like, okay, maybe this isn't my concern. So as my outside advisor, how would you react to me stating that as my position with respect to how much involved I should be or concerned I should be about this cybersecurity executive order?
Yeah, and that's frankly not a very unique position, right? Lots of people are sort of reading this in that same way. Of course, because this is the federal government, things move very, very slowly, right? So, and they're still in flux. A couple of things do stand out, right? There is, even though this is clearly aimed at security, you can't get there without knowing what's in your code, right? And there are going to be minimum standards, and there are going to be there's a lot of references to software bills of material in the executive order itself, and also in some of the other things that we've seen, right? And true, right? The executive order itself talks about dealing with the government, but in the order itself, there's some language about potentially having sort of a nutritional value ingredient style list for your software. So think like the back of the milk jug, right? That tells you that there's milk in it. Well, now we're going to have that for software. Maybe we're going to have a sort of a star style rating system for security, right? The same way that we have Energy Star rating for our appliances. So again, those are security related, but they're more aimed at consumers rather than dealing with the government. There's also, I think, very little doubt that when the government actually starts requiring compliance with this, your customers, especially the bigger ones, right, are going to piggyback on this because maybe they're dealing with the government, right? Or maybe they think, well, hey, wait a second, right? They're doing all of this work to comply with government restrictions. We should ask for it too. The trend is, I think, very clear, right? There's going to be more transparency in third-party component use. We're going to need software bills of material. And I think all of this was definitely true before Log4j. but to the degree that it wasn't at this point, right? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about Log4j. I think everyone else already has. But everything after that is bringing that into sharp relief, right? So the question that I like to ask people is, the day before the Log4j hack news broke, did you know whether you were using it, right? And if the answer is no, right? If the answer is you're running around the morning of asking your CTO, hey, are we relying on this? What's our exposure, right? Then that's not a great sign of your ability to sort of prepare and react to the next one.
And certainly,
there's going to be next one.
Yeah, and certainly, again, your CTO may not know the answer to that question, right? The CEO comes running in with the Wall Street Journal saying, "Do we use this?" Maybe the CTO doesn't know right then and there, but having that individual confident that they can find the answer to that question relatively quickly, right? That they can call somebody up within the organization and say, "Hey, I need to find out, are we using this component? Yes or no? If so," and we did this, right? Obviously, every software company out there had to deal with this. And what struck me is when we were running this exercise was, not just the need, are we using it, but which version are we using, right? Because there was a version issue there. One of the later versions was where the problem was. So ironically, some of the older versions, at least initially, weren't thought of as being that necessarily concerned. So I know here at Revenera, we actually used it from a prioritization perspective, right? To identify which products had it in it. And then a little bit lower was, which version are we currently using? And if it was one of the older ones, great. We could maybe put that aside for a second and focus on the newer versions. And then, of course, we did create the list of, well, we got to go back and fix those older ones too, because while the current issue was around the newer versions, the older versions did have some issues that needed to be addressed as well, that issue brought to light. So, and again, I noticed, Leon, by the way, when you were talking about Log4j and the need to remediate that, not once did you say it was because the government demanded it. And it wasn't, right? It wasn't part of the government standards, right? That was my customers calling me up and saying, "Hey, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal just like your CEO is. Is this a problem for you? What is your plan to remediate it? Where are you at in that plan?" And that was our lives for a couple of days. And I'll admit, having run a pretty good open source program that you've helped us develop, Leon, it wasn't that painful of a process. It wasn't comfortable. Don't get me wrong. Like, you can run a good process, but it was such an easier process in place because our ability to find it and remediate it, find it, prioritize, and remediate was so much easier given the open source compliance program that we have.
Yeah, the starting point is always having that list, right? Knowing what it is that you have. That's the base. That's the foundation. From that, we can do just about anything.
Yep.
So, and I think that's where the guidelines are going to go, right? So NIST has released some guidelines, right? And they're talking about automating the testing, right? So as opposed to sort of humans going in there and poking around, right? Just to make sure that it's consistent. They're talking about code scanning to look for top bugs. But again, right, once you're looking for bugs, you're getting a list of components. And most importantly, they're talking about addressing the included code, right? So libraries, packages, services. So it's not just the code that you've written, it's the code that you're including. There's a little bit of guidance around what a software bill of materials should contain, right? Data fields that document the baseline information about each component, right? That's a lot of wonderful government language, but basically, what is it, what version, who's it from, what's the license? Right, support automation, right? So use something like SPDX, right, just to make it easier for others to consume it. And you should have practices and processes that deal with the requests, generations, and use of bill of materials. One thing that I like to tell people is, since you're doing the review, if you're doing the review, and hopefully you are, don't just have a bill of materials that tells you what the components are, include the usage. Right, because for a lot of these licenses, as Marty, as you know, right, the key is in how you use them, right? And so if you have that right in your software bill of materials, right, that's more than what the SPDX does at the moment, but it will make it easier for you to answer questions, right? Sure. So, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and if you include it in your software bill of materials, you may not have to answer those questions, right? Because the answer is, in theory, available to anybody who is looking at that software bill of materials, right? It precludes the need to have that human-on-human contact in order to get the answer to that question, which just frees up resources and goes to your automation commentary, right? I mean, if you're having to have people have conversations to answer questions, I think that's a really good sign that the program that you're running isn't at that level of automation or breadth that you need it to be in order to ultimately deploy something that is as efficient as it possibly can be.
Right. Yeah, we sort of, everybody has different levels of comfort with different licenses and different components, right, and what they do, but we can all agree on one thing. There's definitely questions that get asked during diligence, right? And there's sort of a baseline set for certain licenses, and we all know what they are, and we sort of all know what the questions are that are coming. And so to a degree that you can have the answers ready, right? If you're, let's say, on the sell side or of a transaction, or if you're if somebody's investing in you or something like that, right? The quicker you can provide those answers, the better prepared you look, the better it looks in general, right?
Yeah.
So I can tell if you're scrambling to answer my questions, or if you actually know what you're doing, right? And that brings great comfort, right? During transactions. If all of a sudden you sort of look around and you go, oh, these guys know what they're doing. Okay, that's good.
And I'll tell you, it's becoming, and again, Revenera is a software company, right? We are getting more the sophistication of our buyers. So absolutely right, Leon. The big events in our world is when we're doing some kind of a macroeconomic transaction. We're buying somebody, we're being looked at to be bought ourselves, whatever that might be. That is probably the best pressure tester for your system as a whole, generically, because they're looking at everything, or you're looking at everything of a target. But more and more of our customers are demanding that as part of their decision as to whether or not we are going to be their vendor of choice, we have to be asking these questions, right? Especially Revenera has a number of solutions that actually get embedded into our customers' products. And that is, years ago, that was never a question that someone would ask us, or maybe 1 out of 100 would ask us for, hey, what is actually in what it is you're telling me I'm going to put in my product? And now that's becoming more and more of a standard operating procedure, even at the RFP level, to want to be able to see that. And so without this program, without being able to put that good foot forward, to your point, Leon, just having the program usually makes so many people just relax a little bit and say, okay, good. They at least know that they're supposed to be looking at this stuff. They understand the construct of what this is supposed to be. And that's great. And again, none of that has to do with the government, right? The government is certainly putting some boundaries around this for us from either a best practices. I'm not sure I'd use best practices per se, but at least from a safe harbor perspective, to put it into a legal term, right? You're getting a sense of what this stuff should look like from what the government is asking folks to do. And as long as you're playing within that area, you've got a pretty good sense of what most of your customers are going to be asking you for, and or your buyers, or your investors, your financiers, whoever that might be.
Yeah, in a way, what we're getting is a form of authority that says the same thing that those of us who have been playing in this field have been saying for a while, right? You need to have this. You need to do this. Now it's coming with the president's seal, right? And so all of a sudden, people are saying, "Oh, okay, all right." So this stuff that you guys have been saying for years, all of a sudden, that's okay. It makes sense. So it's good, right? It validates the approaches that we're taking, and you're absolutely right, by the way, on licensing just in general and customer contracts. We're seeing a lot of the things that we used to see only in mergers and acquisitions, right? We're seeing that same language crop up in customer agreements, right? That you haven't used open source in a bad way. Here's a schedule of all the open source components, right? So that I can review it as well. And it's coming up, and people are just expecting you to have that information, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, especially now the way software is built, right? Software is, and you know this as a software developer. I'm not a software developer, but I've learned enough about it to know, particularly today, software is built, via Legos, right? There are a bunch of little building blocks, and you do have to do this analysis on every single little building block that you're using within your entire code base. And again, when you're a company like Revenera, who is then putting some of that code base into their customers' products, our decisions around open source now impact our customers, because they ultimately are going to be relying upon what we've done as we build up that code base, when they then go out and have to build their software bill of materials for their customers, right? And it's just that buildingness, which is key. And it goes back to that automation issue too, right? Our customers are asking us to say, hey, I'm now going to need to take some of your software bill of materials and embed some of that within my software bill of materials, right? Because not only is your technology going in my products from a technical perspective, your SBOM is going into my SBOM, right? And so you have that kind of parallel track going that is really making these conversations, it can make them trickier. Again, luckily we're in pretty good shape on that front, but that's the kind of conversation that these customers are asking for. Again, just for vendors, they want to know. And if you start to get into, the government's one thing. We also sell into a lot of highly regulated entities, financial institutions, healthcare institutions. They're running the same plays on us, even though we're not going to be embedded in a financial services company's product. We're going to be running in their back office, and they want to know these things. Again, it's all about that security footing. They want to be able to be, because I guarantee you, some of our biggest customers don't use our embedded stuff. Their CTOs were calling down to their back office team saying, hey, do we run any software that has Log4j in it? Someone in their organization said, I don't know. We haven't checked all of our vendors for Log4j. We don't have those software bill of materials. We now have to call every single vendor who's running in our back office and ask them that question. And that is this kind of domino effect that really does permeate this situation, at least for us.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And that's why, SCA tools are again, specifically called out in the executive order, right? So
Sure.
that you get the scanning done, you know exactly what's there. It's just going to become the norm if it isn't already.
Yep, absolutely. All right, perfect. Well, so what you're telling me as outside counsel to in-house counsel is that this doesn't necessarily apply to me directly, but man, is it going to apply to me from an indirect perspective? It's just kind of becoming the market norm. Right?
Yeah. Essentially, I mean, what I could tell you is, you can wait until your customers, every single customer, starts demanding this, right? And then you can scramble, or you can prepare for it because it's coming, right? There's no doubt about it.
Perfect. Or you can wait till the next Log4j and scramble in that cauldron, which is never good. All right, perfect.
Exactly.
All right. So excellent. So the next topic we want to talk about is kind of GPL enforcement and any changes in that regard. I mean, again, my experience has always been that most of the folks who, even if they do most of the individuals who distribute open source, if they find you're not using it correctly, for the most part, they'll call you up, they'll let you know about it. As long as you're reasonably working with them to solve whatever problem and to make whatever changes that they ask you to make. There's not really a lot of litigation out there, right? I mean, as you know, there's not a ton of litigation on this topic out there. The GPL is obviously that big, bad, scary license model that people tout as the boogeyman about, all your open source, all your source code can become open source if you don't abide by it. But again, there's not a ton of litigation out there on that, right?
Yeah, that's fair. There are definitely lawyers out there that would sit there and bring up the big headlines and say, oh, well, these people were sued for hundreds of millions of dollars, or these people were sued for hundreds of millions of dollars. But, we can scare people, but I don't think that gets us anywhere. I think the truth is you're right. Most people are interested in just sort of making this work, right? They're in it, not for profit. There are exceptions, of course, to the rule. We keep a list of companies and individuals that really like to make money off of open source non-compliance, right? They're not going to work with you. They just want a settlement. So that's certainly out there. The problem is that really where it comes into is, again, diligence, right? And that's always the big issue. Lawyers are, as you know, notoriously risk averse. Right. So anytime you have a transaction, whether it's investment, M&A, or again, customer deals, right, especially regulated companies, like you said, financial industry, medical industry, right, the same substantive issues that would come up during a suit come up here, right? It's like, well, how are you using this? Why are you using it? Is there a chance that you're going to get sued, right? Even if that chance of that actual licensor is fairly remote, right, the lawyers are going to really start digging into it. And they're trying to protect against worst case, right, scenario. So, and of course, there's folks like Patrick McCarty, who's been suing companies in Germany, right? He was part of the NetFilters team. And so there is a little bit of good news there. It looks like he signed an agreement with the maintainers of NetFilters. So from here on out, right, he shouldn't be suing people anymore. Hopefully that holds up. But the rumbling that I'm hearing now is that he was successful enough to have encouraged others. So there are these folks that are running around targeting earlier versions of Creative Commons licenses. And Creative Commons licenses aren't perfect for software. They're usually used for images or written works, but I have seen code under them. The problem with them, or well, I don't know if I should call it a problem, the way they're written is that they auto-terminate upon any breach. And of course, if a license automatically terminates without your knowledge, you're in a copyright infringement situation. And they have really esoteric notice and attribution requirements, right? You have to write it out just the right way. And so what people are doing is they're getting these images out there that are under these Creative Commons licenses. They're waiting for people to use them and screw up a little tidbit or a little detail of getting the attribution correct, and then they tell you that, oh, hey, by the way, you're in infringement territory. So I haven't seen it with code yet, but it might happen. So it's just something for us to keep an eye on, especially for basically licenses that auto terminate. Do not. There's no way to reinstate them, right? Got to be a little bit more careful about how we handle them. Doesn't mean we can't use it, right? The code under them just means that we've got to cross our T's and dot our I's when it comes to notice and attribution. And then
that's
the other,
that's where too. I mean, when I think about that issue, again, as a software company where we're using all these, that CCL, that Creative Commons license, is on my list of licenses I really would prefer we don't use, right? And so as we're reviewing the open source components that go into our products, that's one of those ones that's kind of on my list. And the automation project that we've got helps in the sense that my developers know not to even bother to ask me whether or not they can use something that way. They go on, they find something else. And or it gets highlighted, and I have to have an open and honest conversation with developers to explain, okay, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is there really no other option for it, right? And so, that's another one of those benefits of those automation programs is you can change those as you go. So, if another copyright troll pops up using these, and it sounds like you're telling me that there's gonna be, I can go into that automation program and change the settings that I have with respect to whether or not a particular license is deemed to be of high risk, medium risk, low risk, acceptable risk type of a construct.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. It just goes to policy in general, right? One thing that I'm sure you've heard me say before is no policy is ever set in stone. Right.
Exactly.
Things that you find acceptable today, all of a sudden tomorrow you go, you know what, maybe this wasn't as good of an idea as I thought. We sort of changed the approach, or it goes the other way, right? So over the last, obviously not last year, but over the last probably decade or so, I think people have gotten a lot more comfortable with a lot more licenses, right? I used to hear a lot of, well, there's no way we'll use any GPL or LGPL license code in our company at all, right? It's nope. Absolute no. And now people are taking a much more nuanced approach, right? Well, no, we can use it internally, right? We can use it to test. We can use it to, maybe we even get comfortable with hosting it, right? But we're not going to distribute GPL license code that's linked with our code, right? So people are getting more nuanced, and it's because of pushback, and I think rightful pushback from developers, right? Why tie their hands behind their back, right? Yeah. Why make them reinvent the wheel? Right, this code's out there. It works well. It's maintained, right? It's collaborative. Let's not force our guys to have to rewrite it.
Yeah, and for those folks that are in house or listening to this, the reality is that you can use that as an argument for spending some money on an automation tool, right? Because Leon, you're absolutely right. I have developers asking me all the time, "Can I use this?" And if the answer is no, it's not a quick conversation, right? They want to understand why. But the fact that these tools out there and now do allow you to change these rules, and or to your point earlier, right? Tracking, well, how are you going to use it, right? Because I will admit, some of my developers, I love them, but if I tell them yes in one situation, they assume it's going to be yes in a different situation, right? And so an internally developed program is very different from an externally distributed program. They may not understand that nuance, and that's okay. These tools that we have, the scanning tools, the automation tools, the processes, the rules, those can all be tweaked so that when you ask a developer, hey, where are you using it? How are you using it? You can get a more nuanced answer. So I would actually say it's kind of a combination of the two issues. And the one, they're right that we should be able to use these in a more nuanced area. But the tools have created a situation where it's actually easier to be a little bit more nuanced. Back in the day, an absolute no was the only way I could feel really good about it. But if I've got a good scanning tool in place, if I've got a good policy in place, if I've got good rules in place, I've now just opened up the aperture for my developers with respect to what they can use. And that's great. So again, legal people are always looking for budget internally, right? But this is where you go into your engineering department and explain to them, hey, if you help me fund this tool, I can now start to give you more options and a bigger aperture through which you can look at the open source world for use within our environment. What do you say, right? That's again, doesn't always work. CTOs are stingy with their budgets too, but that's the kind of thing that we can use to try to get people to buy in that this is not just about minimizing legal risk, but about expanding business opportunity. And that's always a better conversation.
Right.
I don't know how often you had to go before a CFO asking for money, but if I can go in there and say, this protects us, great, that's a good story. If I can say this helps me grow the business, that's even better. And this is the type of thing that these scanning tools can now allow us to do to create value for our organizations.
Yeah, and maybe in hindsight, we should have put that at the top, right? The biggest change, I think, in the last year or two has been the proliferation of tooling, right? And the tools are getting so much better, right? And they're going to continue to get better.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so let's move on to this SFC one. I have to admit, I've read a little bit about this one. I'll let you dive into it. I'm on the fence still. I mean, again, I think I like the general idea behind a lot of it, but some of the applications got me a little nervous. What's your take on the SFC and the Vizio suit?
Right. So SFC has sued Vizio over their SmartCast system that they include in their TVs, and that's so that you can cast things to them. And it's interesting in a couple of different ways, right? So number one, right, they're not suing as the licensor. Usually the SFC sues on behalf of the people that wrote the code. And in this case, what they did is they did the same thing that you and I would do. They went out and they bought a television. And so now as a consumer, they're saying, well, the GPL says that I am entitled to the source code. Give me the source code. Right. And they're not interested in a financial settlement. They're interested in the source code. So I'm with you. I think in general, I'm okay with why they're doing it, or at least why they think they're doing it. Right. I own a TV I bought a long time ago. It was a Pioneer Plasma, and it came with a little camera that pops up out of the TV so you can Skype your friends. And at the time, right, I went, well, this is the most useless thing I've ever seen on a television, right? Why would I ever want to do this? And then, of course, over the last couple of years, I went, hey, you know what? That's actually kind of useful. Right, because we're all on Zoom, we're all on Skype, this is how we communicate with people now. So let's try it. And it turns out it no longer works because in the years between I bought it and now, either Pioneer or Microsoft, someone has discontinued the app. So now I have a piece of hardware. I have this camera that pops out of my television that doesn't do anything. There is no software that will enable it to work, which kind of stinks. Right. So as a consumer, it would be great if I could have the source code for whatever it was that made it pop up and work. So I could, personally, not me, but somebody else could go out there and write something that would make it work again. Right. So I understand where the SFC is coming from. The question is, are they going to be able to get there? And part of the problem is that we're dealing with GPL version 2 and LGPL version 2.1 code here. And even I think, right, we'll see what the courts decide, of course, but I think even if they win, right, even if it turns out that, yep, Vizio should release the corresponding source code here, and it should be, everything, not just the GPL license bits, but the whole SmartCast thing. So let's assume that they're going to win that. It's not clear to me that what they're going to get is also the ability to then modify the code and put it back on the TV, right? So they might end up with source code that they can't put back onto the appliance, right? So they might not be able to get to what they're trying to achieve. But in any case, it is interesting, right? And I think it's most interesting just because they're suing as a consumer, right? They're suing as if they're you or I, and we'll see. I'm not sure that that's going to lead to a whole bunch of people like us, all of a sudden suing various manufacturers of products just because of cost of litigation. But it's an interesting one to keep an eye on for sure.
Yeah, and I'll admit that is where again, as someone who represents a software company, that is where my fear kind of meter starts to go up a little bit, in the sense that, again, previously, if we violated an open source license, we would get a call from the copyright holder, the licensor, and they would say, hey, I need you to do X, Y, and Z in order to get back into compliance. And that was a usually reasonable one-on-one conversation. if anybody can sue me once they discover that I've made a mistake with respect to how I deploy the technology. And if they're not just looking for monetary settlement, monetary settlements are one thing, but here again, the SFC is asking them to publish the source code. And I understand why, and I get the value of it. Your example is spot on, right? As to why this might be a real thing that consumers should care about. The company, right? I think to myself, wow, that's a really different analysis from my perspective. The idea that I may have a bunch of individuals suing me over and over and over again, which just becomes a very expensive thing. I think I'm with you, though. I agree that without there being a true monetary position here, it would just be, I think that'll be a natural break or governor in the system from it being overwhelming. But I'll admit, the idea that the end users will be given standing to sue, that is a little bit of a nerve-wracking situation for me.
Yeah, and I hope you and I are not giving some lawyers out there an idea of a class action with this here. That would be the opposite of what I think we're looking for.
That's right. Yeah. It's interesting. So, you had mentioned your TV to me as we were prepping for this, and I'll admit, again, as a software vendor, one of the things I usually fight for is the right to perhaps remove features and functionality from subsequent versions of my technology. Now, in software, it's totally different, right? If you don't like the changes I've made to the latest and greatest version, you just choose not to install it and you can live with the last one. Or the worst case, you have to make a decision. Do I like the new features or do I prefer the old ones? And then you get to make that call. I'll admit, though, in a SaaS world, as most of the software starts to become more and more either subscription-based or hosted from a SaaS perspective, the end customer's ability to control some of that stuff does change. And so there's an interplay here as to how the software market shifts from on-prem perpetual licensing that customers control to subscription-based SaaS licensing that the customers don't control so much, that I do think make your hardware analogy actually relevant potentially in the software space as well, right? Because I, as the vendor, need, and again, Microsoft pioneered, no one's arguing they did anything wrong.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Because 3 years ago, someone did some analysis and said that camera's not really attracting people. It's just expensive. Let's just stop maintaining it.
Or they added features to the app. Yeah, or they added features to the app that just wouldn't work on the hardware that is the television, right? Or there's security issues, right? I mean, look, I can flip my example on its head, right? So the idea of me giving the source code that operates the camera on my television to some complete stranger out there to modify and put back on my TV, what's to say they're not going to be spying on me?
Yep.
Right. So, and then once that happens, what's to say that I'm not going to say, hey, well, look, Pioneer, you let this happen, right? This is your camera. So I get, from a vendor standpoint, I absolutely understand why these things are locked down, why they maybe need to be locked down. But excuse me. But it's an interesting interplay, as all of open source is, of course.
Yeah. But like with everything open source related, right, there is a way to remediate and protect yourself from having to deal with these issues, right? And that last bullet there, right, we can scan your code on a repeated basis, put together a policy that allows you to track and make decisions, informed decisions about what's going into your products. How are you using that? How are you asking your customers to use it? And again, as long as you're going in eyes wide open, you can create a plan that, for the most part, does in fact mitigate a lot of these risks.
Absolutely, right. That way, you don't get yourself into a situation where somebody disagrees. Well, you might get yourself into a situation where somebody disagrees with what you've done, but at least you have an answer.
Yeah.
Right.
So, exactly. All right. Well, as we just talked about some obsolete technology that then became relevant technology, let's talk about open source in emerging technology. And again, I think this may be a place, Leon, where I'm going to have to lean on you a lot with respect to the issues here. Not to say that Revenera isn't cutting edge software provider themselves, but I think there are, as you were mentioning, there are some interesting developments within emerging software or emerging technology that has an open source element to it. So with that, I'll let you dive into it.
Yeah, I think the thing that we're seeing a lot of play with is data models or AI related use, right? So you have all the typical third-party software concerns and open source concerns that you do with regular software, but on top of it, right? So if you're relying on AI, you need to create models, right? And you need to train those models. And there's lots of uncertainty in that space, right? So data collections can have one set of terms for the collection itself, and then the collection, let's say, consists of images. And then each image can have its own copyright and licensing issues. And then they're the subjects of the images, right? What if the images in the collection are all images of children, for example, right? That brings in a whole different set of issues, not obviously related to open source, but just in general, right? Things for you to consider. So if you're using data models, right? So what do you need to look at? You need rights to the data, right? You need the right to access it, possess it, store it, right? You need the rights to modify the data, right? So you're probably going to need to annotate it so that you're for training purposes, right? You need to consider the results of the training, right? So what the outcome is it related to the training materials? Is it a derivative work, right? Does it maintain the licensing that's coming in? If it's not a derivative work, will somebody consider it, fruit of the poison tree if there's ever a licensing issue? What about new creations, right, that you make from the trained model? So Microsoft has this let's call it somewhat controversial thing called Copilot, right, where they're going to go through, and because of their ownership of GitHub, they'll sort of look at all the code there, use it to train this program, which will then spit out code as you're typing it. Wouldn't that be awesome? So the question, of course, is what happens if it contains elements of the code that was used to train it? Right? Are you in a copyright infringement situation here? Right? And there are lots of ways that they can avoid it. There's they can use permissively licensed code to train, but there are lots of questions in this space. So think, for example, let's say there's a program that's trained to recognize pictures of cats, right? Are there rights issues associated with the use of images of cats, right? That you're doing? Let's take it a step further, right? Let's say the program actually draws cats, right? It produces images of cats based on what it thinks a cat looks like, right? So you tell it, I want a calico kitten, and it draws you one because it has seen enough images of that, and it knows what that's supposed to look like. So are the cats that the program's drawing, even if none of them were the exact cat that it was trained with, right? They're all combinations of information. Even if not a single pixel is shared, are they a derivative work of the trained data? Right, for the models themselves, right? How are they implemented, right? Is your model implemented to spec? What's the licensing on the spec, right? Was there an algorithm that was covered in a dissertation, right? Is the algorithm copyrightable, or is it not? What's the licensing there? So there's just a ton of questions here, and unfortunately, it's one of those situations where I think the law needs to catch up to the tech. Right. So right now, and this is not unique, right? This happens all the time. It happened, many years ago with just general open source compliance issues. People for a while weren't sure if the GPL was enforceable as a license, right? I don't think anyone argues that it's not now. So I think the law needs to catch up, right? And unfortunately, what's happening now is that it hasn't, and so we're having to apply sort of old law to this emerging tech. And that doesn't often make sense to developers or maybe even normal humans, for that matter, the non-lawyers in the room, right? I've had many a frustrating conversation with people that go, well, no, but look, logically speaking, there is no way that this thing that I'm doing should be a derivative work of this thing that I used to train it, and it doesn't make any sense for it to be considered to be this way. And I can agree with you, right? Sure, logically it makes sense, but that's just not where the law is necessarily currently, right? There's just a lot of gray area there. So but definitely something that I think is gonna get a lot more interesting.
Yeah. I think that's right. And again, Urban doesn't sell cat drawing software, so it doesn't particularly.
Not yet.
That's true. That's not. Never say never, Marty. Never say never. But going off script a little bit here, I do wonder, would the same analysis apply to kind of data sets, right? Where you're looking for analytics on how to run your business, right? I would think a lot of that could come into play as well. I think the derivative work stuff in particular is an interesting kind of side analysis that one would have to do there.
Yeah, and it goes back to your point about tooling, right? We've gotten
Yeah.
so much better at catching the easy problems that we're now diving into this, right? A few
Yeah.
years ago, if this had come up, oh, we're using this data set, it would have been like, okay, well, what's the overall license, right? What's the top level license that whoever's giving me the data set is telling me about? And then that's where we would have stopped, right? Because just diving deeper wasn't possible, and now it is, and
Yeah.
now it's something that people are going to start asking questions about.
Yeah, yeah, and I got to admit, this is when I do prefer being in-house to being in a firm like yourself. Is that I'm rarely asked for a definitive answer. Where I am more inclined to ask people like you for a definitive answer, and here is that situation where there isn't one, right? Which means you have to tell your business owners, regardless of which direction you go in this particular area, you're going to be taking on some risk. Why? Because the law is backwards looking and the technology is looking
Yeah,
forward.
the,
Right?
the
But yeah,
trick is to find the path that minimizes the risk,
that's right.
right?
Yeah.
So, and we can do that, right? We can't say that, yeah, with 100% certainty, if you use this data set in this particular way, right? Usually, it's all very, very fact specific, right? And sometimes we get to that answer, right? We nail everything down, right? Yep, the data itself is under the open database license. The data in it is public domain, right? It's not an issue. This is perfectly fine to use. Other times it's not as clear, right? But then you go into the facts of the situation. You try to come up with something that is as minimal on the risk front as it can be.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, fascinating stuff. I mean, that is the beauty of one of the things I do like about being a lawyer is the fact that there's always going to be something new that we have to try to apply it to. And next year when we do this, Leon, we'll be doing it. We'll be having the same conversation about some other emerging technology. Hopefully, by the end of this year, maybe we have some answers for folks as to how to apply it to the cat drawing situation. But there's always going to be something else that we have to worry about. So speaking of looking forward, let's talk about where are you? Again, I think we did a great job kind of summarizing. Hey, based on what happened in 2021, what do I need to do with my business? Right? Again, Leon, this is a lot of our conversations are about that, right? It's like, hey, great. What do I have to do for Revenera for 2022 based on what we saw develop in 2021? And as soon as we have that laid out, the next question we always go to is, okay, great. Let's see if we can, let's look into the crystal ball and let's figure out what should we be looking at with respect to 2022, just to keep an eye on it. Again, we don't, 2021 is in the rearview mirror, so we can certainly dissect that and make some definitive plans with that. But what are the gray areas that we're going to come across in 2022 that we should be thinking about?
I think the overall theme is that we're going to have to go deeper in terms of our review, right? So again, sort of on that list of things that a few years ago we would have never considered, thinking about our projects with incompatible or impossible licenses, right? What used to happen was, again, people would just sort of look at that top level license and they would stop. And it used to be fairly hard to get, right? You didn't really know what that top level license was. And that's where you guys at Revenera would come in and you do the code scan and surface it. And then because you're doing a much better job of not just doing that, but also surfacing all of the underlying dependencies, right? All of the sort of the tree, that forensic analysis, right? Now we're starting to get into a situation where that top level license might not match some of the other code in the repo, right? So there was an example last year. There was a very small project called My Magic, and it was MIT licensed, right? So permissively licensed. And all of a sudden, somebody reached out to this poor developer and said, "Hey, by the way, you're using my code and it's GPL licensed. Your project can't be MIT licensed because you've bundled and linked with this GPL licensed code." And his reaction was to immediately change the license to GPL, pull all of the existing versions that were out there, and it caused just chaos because it turned out that this small little project was used in tons and tons and tons of places, right? And I remember at the time I was thinking, oh, if only he'd had 15 minutes worth of lawyer's time, right? There was a better fix here, like this. He didn't need to do this. But I completely understand, right? As a former developer and as a human being, I can understand that once you get that notice of, hey, by the way, you've done something wrong, your first instinct is, I'm going to go fix this, right? And that's what he did. But yeah, that's what you're going to get into is that some of the projects, the bigger ones that you see, the open source projects, are fairly good at showing you all of their dependencies, right? And explaining any that don't make sense, right? So for an MIT licensed project, if they're using GPL licensed test scripts, right? And they'll say, well, yeah, that's fine because you're not going to then distribute test scripts. So your code is going to be fine, right? So you're going to be okay. Others are not as good at this, right? And so you need tools like your guys' tool that they'll go out there and say, yeah, okay, so the overall project says MIT, but there's this GPL licensed code in there. Let's start asking questions, right? Let's figure this out. And others are even worse, right? They try to hide the ball as much as they can. So again, it just comes down to having to do the work and having to scan it. So I think again, right?
Let's not sell you short either, right? Scanning is a great piece of the puzzle, and you're absolutely, and it's probably the first piece and the most important piece, right? But there's that secondary piece, right? Which is to say, okay, great, this appears to be inconsistent. The way I solve that problem a lot of the times is I give it a little bit of thought, but then I call you, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that is a key element to that, is getting that right outside resource to help you analyze these issues. Because again, it's funny, you actually mentioned that you wish that the mime
My magic. Yep.
thank you, the mime magic, they needed, before they took everything down, they needed 15 minutes worth of legal advice. But before that, right, if they'd had 10 minutes of advice when they were creating the original, they were making that decision, like, I'm going to write this code, I'm going to embed this GPL component. What license do I want to have on the overall thing? That would have been a wonderful time for them to have gotten some advice as well to minimize or mitigate or even remediate entirely the existence of this problem, right? And that to me is where the connection between the tools that, like the one that Revenera sells, and the services that lawyers like yourself provide is really kind of where those two things come together. Because as we've talked about, none of this stuff is necessarily black and white. A lot of it is gray. A lot of it based on your risk analysis, your preferences, your concerns. And then again, it gets down to a technical level as well. You got to get the third stool in there, is to somebody from engineering, particularly with me. You may understand a lot of this as a software developer, but as someone who wasn't a software developer, I need a technical person in the room to explain to me, well, how are we using it exactly? Okay, great. How are we using it compared to the license type that we have and the ultimate use case that we're going to deploy this under? Those three things all have to come into play in order to get us to a spot where we're all comfortable that we're moving forward in a responsible, defensible manner.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, right? They're often, people think that once they get the code scan report, they're done, right? They have it. It's all set, right? We've done it. We've checked the box. But like you said, in reality, right? If that's the case, you want to approach it, you're going to be remediating a lot more than you need to, right? Because there are going to be things out there that are flagged, and then it turns out that no, maybe that was okay, right? Maybe because of the use, you could have gotten to be okay with the way it's being used. But unless you do the review, you're never going to find out.
Yep, absolutely.
So yeah, and I think the other thing that's definitely going to increase is notice and attribution compliance, right? It used to be, I think, I wouldn't say acceptable, but not surprising that we would get to a transaction, or we would go in and start examining sort of what a company does as their current practices, and they would say, well, yeah, we haven't gone to the notice and attribution part, right? And I get why. It used to be extremely hard, right? So that last bit, right, the collecting of the licenses and putting them all in a notice and attribution file, that's something that's difficult. And it's in ways, automation sometimes makes it more difficult, right? Because we all have this tendency to go, okay, well, we want to focus because, like you said, limited budgets, limited time. The last thing the developers want to do is talk to lawyers. Right, they're out there to write software. They want to develop things. They want to create the next best thing. They don't want to do compliance. Nobody does. So what they want to do is they want to have a policy that allows them to bypass legal as much as they can. Right. Mm-hmm. So for permissively licensed components, there's no reason to wait for somebody in legal to say, okay, well, have you collected the license text? Right. Have I checked all the boxes? So automation often just says, okay, this is permissive. Fine, it's approved. But then it creates a gap, because when you get to notice and attribution for all these permissive licenses, the only thing they really ask is, provide the notice and attribution, right? Provide a copy of our license downstream. And if you haven't collected it, you can't really do that.
Yep.
And so, there were sort of various carve outs and things that we used to do and say, okay, well, we'll do that for our direct dependencies, but we won't do it for the indirect dependencies because just going down that rabbit hole costs so much money. It's unreasonable. We can't possibly do this. So it's either, we do some or we do none, and we'll opt for doing some. But now, again, leveraging the latest tech, right? Leveraging automation and tooling, we can collect those necessary licenses, right? We can take all of those auto-approved things. We can cross-check them against what's anticipated, right? So we can take that Revenera scan that says, okay, this should be a BSD license or an MIT license, right? And we can say, okay, well, this is what our tooling has found. Well, it turns out this isn't an MIT license, right? This turns out to be the Mozilla public license, right? And then we can dig into it and say, okay, well, who's wrong here, right? Or is it the case that both are right, right? And there's both licenses are in there. Once we figure it out, we can spit out notion attribution file, right? And what I like to tell people is if you're working with someone who can't say what I just said, who can't say that they can do that, ask them why not, and ask them how it is that you're supposed to comply with your notice and attribution requirements, right?
And I think it's funny. I think the reality is that there's no good answer to the why not question, right? It's not as if I can arm you or my developers or my sales team with an answer that makes whoever's asking the question feel better, because if you can't do it, there is no good reason why you can't do it, because you can, right? The reality is that you can. You may not have done it yet, but you can't say you can't do it. Not with the scanning tools out there, not with the subject matter experts that you have available to you. If you can't do it, it's because you haven't done it. If you haven't done it, it's because you chose not to do it.
And I think the days of having to unleash a group of paralegals, right, to go out there and download all of these licenses at an extremely cost prohibitive sort of situation, those are over.
Yeah.
Right. We have, again, even us staid old law firms, which we're not, but even law firms, right? We have the tooling to do this, right? We can cut down the cost dramatically in terms of doing this for all of these permissive licenses that you need to comply with. So it's this is going to, excuses won't work on notice and attribution.
That's right. That's right. All right, excellent. Well, with that, Leon, this has been great. I do think, it's always good, particularly for more of a generalist like myself, to take a moment at least once a year to just kind of take a quick review of open source related risks generally, right? Unlike you, I don't live in this water day in, day out. And so I think, at least taking a look at these annually. So we've got a slide up here. It's a little bit more of an eye chart than I think most of our other slides here. That will include in the materials for people to reference, because again, I think this is the type of stuff that you just, again, if you're not in it all day every day, this is a good reminder of the types of things that you have to do. And as I mentioned earlier, I know one of the things that I use this review for, not only to refresh my recollection as to what are the things that I'm concerned about, this is also part of where I start to develop that justification for budget, right? To say, hey, what are the risks that I see here that I think will most resonate with the executives that I have to go convince to give me some more money to go solve this problem, whether it be deploying a tool like Revenera's tool, hiring a subject matter expert like you, Leon. These are the types of things that I do start to look at. Then again, as I mentioned earlier, I like to then invert them and say, okay, great, which of these risks can actually be spun as an opportunity? Right. And I think you struck on one earlier, right, which is the more flexibility that I can give my engineers to go focus on the art of the possible with an easy process that they can follow to determine if their art of the possible is okay or not, is so much better now. And the depth that we can go into, right? I mean, you talked earlier about that top line. Well, okay. Yeah, if it used to be X, that would be, if it was GPL, we can't use it. Well, now we can stop and go a little bit deeper and say, well, what are you going to use it for? How are you going to use it? What else is in there? Where can we change how you want to use it in order to make sure that you can use it in a way that meets my requirements from a legal protection perspective? And so the more we can take these risks and turn them into opportunities, I think I think the better. Are there any areas here on this though that you think would be good to highlight? Are you getting questions from your customers and you have to remind them of some of these kind of basics and bring them back to, hey, remember, Marty, remember when we spoke last year, I had to tell you about this. I'm going to tell you it again. Are you finding anything that in particular on this slide that you think is worth pointing out to people?
Yeah, I think at the risk of having people fall asleep while they watch this, right? As we could go on about open source for probably the next 6 hours and be perfectly fine, but not everyone has that kind of stamina. I think that the main takeaway for the risks here is that there's really not a lot of difference between commercially licensed software and open source software when it comes to licensing risks, right? So it's a contract. And just like any contract, right, if you don't comply with the terms, it goes away. And then you're in infringement territory. Some of the key things that that a lot of open source contracts have, right, are the automatic grants of licenses to patents, right, mm-hmm. whether they're implied or express. So that's something to keep an eye on if you have a patent portfolio. There's defensive patent termination clauses, right? So you might lose access to a component or a tool you're using if you make a claim against somebody else because they're infringing your patents, right? So again, does it mean you can't use the tool? Probably not, right? But it just means that you have to be a little bit more careful in your review. Some of the other ones, I mean, security risks, I don't think we need to spend any more time on, right? We all know what they are. One thing that I like to tell people about remediation is, and you made a good point earlier, right? If the developers talk to the lawyers first and then go develop, right? A lot of times that's hard to justify, especially for startups, right? Why spend money on lawyers when you can barely pay your developers? And the reason is very simple. It's a lot of times it's easier to make the right call the first time, rather than having to re-engineer something because you're done. You're going in through, let's say, Series D, and somebody says, "Hey, wait a second. This foundational piece of software that you have here, you can't use in the way that you're using, right? So what do you do now, right? Now the cost of redoing it is a lot more than the original cost." And just to say it too, right? That initial conversation with a lawyer, right? That doesn't have to be particularly expensive. Right. Putting together a policy that sort of outlines what risks you're going to accept, what risks you're not going to accept isn't, a hundreds of thousands of dollars exercise. It's not even tens of thousands of dollars of exercise, right? I like to tell people that if your open source policy is over 2 or 3 pages long, you're doing it wrong, right? No developer is ever going to read it, much less comply with it. So that's the key takeaway is, right, don't treat open source as if it's different, right? Treat it as any contract and make sure that you understand what's in there. And if you don't, find somebody like me or somebody else that can help you. And then, do it early enough so that whatever pain you have when it comes to remediation, compliance, and all of that, it's all taken care of, and you don't need to scramble towards the end.
Yep, perfect. Well, Leon, this has been great for me. Like I said, getting a chance to talk to you, get a really deep understanding for what are the subject matter experts in this area talking about is always super helpful, right? And again, we kind of just real quick recap, right? We looked at the fact that we've got some GPL enforcement issues that are out there that are a little bit more nuanced than what we've dealt with in the past. We've got the security. The government security SBOM initiative that is out there, and then obviously we have some new enforcement or some new applications of open source in kind of a new technology world, and then obviously then here kind of the overview of all of the risks associated with open source. And again, I always hate talking about risk without really focusing on the fact that open source is an opportunity. Of course, there are risks associated with it, but open source itself is actually a really, really valuable tool that, when used properly, can really unlock some tremendous value for those of us who make use of it. And it's really important to be able to set up your organization in a way to use that resource responsibly. That doesn't add risk, but in fact just does untap the potential that the open source community provides. Make sure that we're there. All right, Leon, it's always a pleasure. I look forward to connecting next time. Maybe we'll come back before the end of this year and take a look at some of the developments, right? That SFC versus Vizio suit, I think, is going to be a real interesting place for us to come back and talk about it in the future, perhaps. But this legal landscape is shifting, right? And open
Yep.
source is a big part of that. And I always appreciate your time and energy and helping me work through these issues.
All right. My pleasure, as always.
Perfect. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Yep. Thanks.